The ceasefire between the US and Iran is facing its most serious test yet after the two sides exchanged fire and accusations in the Strait of Hormuz. Washington said Tehran launched missiles, drones and boats at 3 naval destroyers, prompting strikes on Iranian military sites. Iran said it was retaliating after the US targeted an Iranian oil tanker and carried out aerial attacks on several coastal areas. Despite the escalation, Donald Trump insists the ceasefire is holding.
They trifled with us today. We blew them away. They trifled. I call that a trifle. I'll let you know when there's no ceasefire. You won't have to know. If there's no ceasefire, you're not going to have to know. You're just going to have to look at one big glow coming out of Iran. And they better sign their agreement fast.
Well, as we've just heard from Mr. Trump, the US is still waiting for Iran's response to its latest peace proposal, a one-page memorandum of understanding that would create a 30-day period to negotiate an end to the war. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was asked about it earlier.
We're expecting a response from them today at some point. We have not received that yet, as you know, in the last hour, but perhaps that will come. Their system is still highly fractured and a bit dysfunctional as well, so that may be serving as an impediment. I hope it's a serious offer. I really do.
Well, let's speak to our correspondent in Washington, Joel Gunter. Joel, President Trump says the ceasefire is holding. Is that the wider feeling in Washington?
Well, yeah, President Trump has been typically bullish. You just heard there stressing that, in his view, US forces are dominating Iranian forces in the Strait, carrying out US airstrikes, of course. And there was that threat there that he wouldn't have to tell people whether the full conflict had resumed because you would see an orange glow coming from Iran. But at the same time, the president has sought to play down the notion of a return to a full-scale conflict. He described the strikes, the US strikes, somewhat colourfully as a, quote, love tap. So Trump and officials in the wider Trump administration are trying to play down the idea that this might escalate further. It's clearly not something that Trump wants at this stage. It has caused tension with the US's Gulf Arab allies in recent days over Trump's plan to reopen the strait by the short-lived plan to reopen the strait by force. So there is a feeling that there is no appetite on either side here for a return to conflict. The Iranians have accused the US of violating the ceasefire agreement, so slightly stronger language, but no sense from that side either that they want to see an escalation here. Both sides hoping that this memorandum of understanding, this short, what we understand to be a one-page document, is instead going to be the vehicle for a resolution of this conflict.
And what is being said about a potential response by Iran to the latest peace proposal?
Well, we heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio today that they were anticipating a response from the Iranians on that today. It's obviously getting quite late now in Iran. We haven't heard yet that that has arrived. But that is what essentially the Americans are waiting for, is a response on this brief memorandum. Now, it's important to make the point that coming to an agreement on this memo is essentially just the beginning of the hard work. The memo, as we understand it, is just a page that sets out what they will agree to negotiate on and if they can come to terms. So if we get a response from Iran, whether that's today or in the coming days, that's the starting gun on the really difficult work of the negotiations over the substantive issues. Enrichment, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's support for proxies, sanctions on Iran. These are the really difficult issues that will have to be worked through in the coming days and weeks if we can get to an agreement between the two sides on this initial memorandum.
Joel Gunter, thank you. The Iranian Foreign Ministry says the war is, in their words, a nominal ceasefire situation. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has accused Washington of undermining diplomatic efforts by opting for a reckless military adventure every time a diplomatic solution was on the table. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guards say they've seized an oil tanker, the Ocean Koi, in the Gulf of Oman, east of the Strait. over what they claim was an attempt to disrupt Iran's oil exports. With me is BBC Persian's Siavash Adalan. Siavash, just tell us, are we still expecting an Iranian response by the end of today?
Yes, we were in fact expecting it last night when suddenly news came out that Tehran's air defenses were activated and sounds of explosions were being heard not just in Tehran but in Iran's southern coastal cities. And then it turned out that there were these skirmishes, there were tensions in the Strait of Hormuz. And then came out Iran's narrative as opposed to US's narrative. Donald Trump said that it had destroyed every drone and every missile that had come towards the US navies, whereas Iran said that 3 US vessels were trying to cross the Strait of Hormuz. That's when they came under attack by Iran. Iran inflicted considerable damage, it said, to the US vessels, and then the US vessels had to retreat. And then it was in response to those attacks that the US apparently hit a few points where they thought there were some military installations in one of Iranian islands and one of Iranian cities called Bandar Abbas. And then in response to that, Iran threw missiles towards the United Arab Emirates, and that's continuing on today as well. So I think that may have delayed Iran's response because we weren't sure whether that was just going to be a little break in the ceasefire or whether that was just, a slight pause in the ceasefire. So we're expecting tonight. It's quite late in the evening in Iran, so maybe it won't come tonight. Maybe it will come tomorrow, but it all depends on what is in that one-page memorandum by the US and how that compares to the counter-proposal that Iran had put forward, to which now the US is responding.
And when you hear President Trump, making that sort of verbal threat again about, seeing an orange glow if the military activity did fully resume, has there been any response to that sort of language? Or
I think the Iranians are pretty much used now to that kind of language. It doesn't, when he threatened Iran with destroying its civilization or using nuclear weapons and so on, I think Iranians are pretty much used to that. They don't appreciate, obviously, that kind of intimidation, but I don't think it's going to affect the negotiations.
Okay, Siavash Adalan, thank you so much. Well, as we've been hearing there, the tensions do appear to be rippling across the region once again, with the United Arab Emirates reporting fresh attacks. It said its air defences engaged with 2 ballistic missiles and 3 drones from Iran earlier today. Our correspondent Carrie Davis is in Dubai. What's the latest from the region there, Carrie?
Well, we did get confirmation from the UAE Ministry of Defence. They said that they had engaged with 3 drones and also 2 ballistic missiles. This is, of course, not the first time we had these warnings of missile attacks coming from Iran from the Ministry of Defence here in the UAE. There was one on Monday and on Tuesday. And this is, of course, after weeks of relative calm in the Gulf because of that ceasefire. So, of course, additional concerns about what this might mean and how the UAE and how the wider Gulf might be impacted if this conflict does spark up again further. And the other thing we have been hearing recently is the fact that the US Central Command has also now said that they have also disabled 2 more vessels entering an Iranian port. Now, this happened a few days ago as well, and it was that Iran said was a violation of the ceasefire agreement between the US and Iran. So whether there will be a subsequent response to this too is something that we are waiting to hear. But of course, a large amount of attention, people waiting nervously to know what will happen with this Iran response that we are still anticipating. As we've been hearing, we've been waiting several days, expecting the response to come, but at the moment it does not seem, despite the fact that the US keeps saying that they're expecting it imminently, we don't seem to be getting anything yet from Iran.
Carrie Davis, thank you very much. Meanwhile, fighting has intensified between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Lebanese armed group. Lebanon says 5 people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes in the south of the country, whilst Hezbollah said it had launched missiles at a military base in northern Israel in retaliation for ongoing Israeli attacks, with sirens sounding in the port city of Haifa. Let's go to Beirut and our correspondent Lina Sinjab. Lina, Hezbollah and Israel did agree a truce last month, but the fighting has continued.
Well, it hasn't stopped, actually, especially in the south. Every single day there were airstrikes, there were evacuation orders, and that continued yesterday and today. And the government says that at least 5 people were killed today, including 2 women. Yesterday, a paramedic was killed as well. Hezbollah is also launching attacks into northern Israel. This is all happening at a time where the 3rd round of the negotiations was announced. It's due to take place next Thursday and Friday. And, while the government is pressing ahead, trying to ensure that they can guarantee a lasting ceasefire, a way to protect the sovereignty of Lebanon, to ask the Israelis to leave their troops to move out of Lebanon, as they are occupying a big swathe of the south now, right by the border. All these efforts by the government are still ongoing, but on the ground in the south, the reality is completely different. And Hezbollah by itself is saying that as long as the Israeli attacks are going, they are rejecting these negotiations. They're also saying that these negotiations should put a condition that, there's a full ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire, and for the Israeli troops to pull back. But the Israelis are saying they have the right to defend northern Israel, to defend their territories, and to eliminate any threat coming from Hezbollah. And this is really dragging on. The civilians are affected, civilians are being killed, and evacuation orders every day means that more and more people are displaced and not able to go back to their homes, while big swathe of the land, the homes, the buildings, the territory have been destroyed in the south.
Lina Sinjab, thank you very much indeed. They're live in Beirut. Well, Ione Wells is our correspondent in Jerusalem. And Ione, we heard there from Lina about these talks. And just to let you know, the US State Department has just put out a statement on those talks with some more detail, confirming May the 14th and 15th, saying that these will be intensive talks aiming to break decisively from what they called the failed approach of the last 2 decades and try to build a framework for lasting peace and security, the full restoration of Lebanese sovereignty, and much more besides. So ambitious for these talks to succeed, clearly.
Yeah, that's right. There is a lot of pressure on this 3rd round of talks. It's expected at the moment that these talks are going to happen at a diplomatic level, potentially now with some military figures involved. The US has been pushing for a higher level round of negotiations between the Lebanese president and the Israeli prime minister directly, but so far that is something which Lebanon has rejected unless there is a security agreement in place and unless there is a stop to Israeli strikes in Israeli-occupied southern Lebanon. Now, we know a bit about what both sides want to achieve out of these negotiations. Israel wants essentially a complete disarmament of the armed group Hezbollah. That is something which, in theory, the Lebanese government say they are working towards. Whether or not they can achieve that, though, is another matter. The Lebanese government, from their side, want Israeli forces out of southern Lebanon. They also want an end to Israeli strikes. And as we heard a little earlier as well, Hezbollah itself doesn't think that these negotiations should be taking place at all while there are still ongoing strikes. I think the elephant in the room, really, though, around this 3rd round of negotiations is that after the last round of negotiations, there was this ceasefire that was agreed on the 16th of April, but everybody in the region is essentially describing that as a ceasefire in name only. As you've been discussing already, there have been continuous strikes still going on in southern Lebanon by Israeli forces. About 120 people killed in just the last week, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. A member of Lebanon's civil defense was announced killed today as well. And similarly, Hezbollah has continued to carry out attacks and fire rockets into targets in northern Israel. Just today, we heard from Hezbollah that they had targeted a military site in northern Israel in retaliation for some of those strikes in southern Lebanon. But also, for the first time since that ceasefire, we heard sirens go off in the northern city of Haifa too, showing just how fragile this ceasefire is and why both sides are accusing each other of breaking it.
Ione Wells in Jerusalem, thank you. Well, oil prices rose after the US and Iran traded blows in the Strait of Hormuz. The global Brent oil benchmark price rose almost 3% to nearly $103 a barrel at one point, before falling back to around $100. More than a fifth of the world's oil and gas usually passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which has been effectively blocked since the start of the US-Israel war with Iran. Let's speak to our business correspondent Samira Hussein in New York. Samira, just tell us more about these prices now and what they indicate.
Right. I think a lot of these prices will move according to the diplomatic machinations that we have been hearing about throughout the program. And so with every piece of news that gives traders hope that there could be a resolution to this war, you see that there is a drop in oil prices. And so even a day earlier, we saw that oil prices had dipped to under $100 a barrel. And that was on the basis that perhaps there was going to be some kind of negotiated peace, that the two sides at least are exchanging diplomatic cables through the Pakistanis. But now you have a situation in which you've seen that the two sides are, exchanging gunfire, exchanging missiles rather, and therefore you've seen a spike in the price of oil.
And Samira, we've heard today also that European airlines worried about jet fuel can now use US grade fuel to help with the shortages.
Right. So this is a really big issue because Europe depends so heavily on a lot of the oil that comes through the Strait of Hormuz. You'll see that the pressures for Europe are really strong. And so you're seeing a lot of cancellations of flights. And now there's this possibility of using US grade jet fuel. Now, the difference really has to do with the freezing point of those particular fuels, that the freezing point for US jet fuel is a little bit higher, so probably less ideal for more Arctic routes, but something that is used in the United States, and certainly something that you're going to be seeing on EU airlines or European airlines quite soon to try and alleviate some of that pressure.
Samira Hussein in New York, many thanks indeed. Well, let us get some in-depth analysis on today's events now with our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams. And Paul, is this really a ceasefire if we've seen, further military activity in the last 24 hours?
Well, look, it's a ceasefire because Donald Trump wants it to be a ceasefire. It is absolutely clear that for all his repeated apocalyptic warnings about what might happen to Iran if they don't bend to his will, he is extremely reluctant to go back to the all-out use of force. He thought, but by using it back at the end of February and into March, that Iran would collapse, would capitulate, would do his bidding, that he would have in Iran a situation comparable, albeit on a much bigger scale, to the one that he had just successfully pulled off in Venezuela, again through the use of American firepower. It simply hasn't worked out that way. And even when he decides to use military might to escort or to help vessels to get out of the Gulf, it triggers an Iranian response that is something that Trump's Gulf allies are simply cannot tolerate, are alarmed about. He doesn't consult with them when he does that. And that's why we saw this Project Freedom lasting just 36 hours, with the Saudis apparently saying, you can't carry on doing this, you're not going to be able to use our bases and our airspace. And so Donald Trump decided not to do that. So every time he tries to use some modicum of force, it seems to blow up in his face. Iran, meanwhile, seems willing and able to withstand the pressure that's being placed on it at the moment, doesn't mind the odd skirmish, and seems to be willing to wait this out. This is proving more difficult for Donald Trump than it is for the Iranian regime. And I think it is clear that the Americans are desperate to get a reply from the Iranians, and the Iranians are perhaps in no hurry to provide it.
And Axios has been reporting today that the US Vice President J.D. Vance is in Qatar for talks on potential mediation. I mean, what is the likelihood, in your view, at this stage of any kind of peace talks emerging?
Look, it is always a possibility. We've already had that one round in Islamabad several weeks ago. We came close to a second round. Pakistan has not given up on its hopes to broker some kind of a deal. Other regional parties like the Qataris, like Oman, the Egyptians, the Saudis, everyone wants to try and find a negotiated settlement. And so that diplomatic activity, which is so far, proved elusive in terms of resulting in anything, it continues, and it may at some point yield a deal. Although the deal that it would yield in the first place would be, as Joel Gunter was saying earlier on, merely the cessation of hostilities and a kind of roadmap or blueprint for the really tough negotiations on Iran's nuclear program and other issues. When after all, that is primarily why Donald Trump went to war in the first place, to rid Iran of it once and for all of its nuclear capabilities. But it does look as though, if we do get some kind of negotiation going, the nuclear issue will be not the first thing, but the last thing to be sorted out.
And when we look back at the Obama deal and how long that took, the huge teams that were involved, does it look likely that this White House would proceed in that kind of way, even if, as you said, we got to that starting point?
Well, they definitely don't have the patience for that kind of diplomatic initiative, which took years. But they, at the same time, want a deal which they can sell as better than the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Better because it will probably place much greater limits on Iran's ability to enrich uranium for a much more extended period of time. But it takes a long time to get that kind of deal. I wouldn't mind betting that in the State Department or somewhere else, there are officials copying and pasting those bits of the JCPOA which the Trump administration feels it can live with, while trying to come up with formula to make it a better deal. Because otherwise, Donald Trump runs the risk of reaching an agreement with Iran, which everyone turns around, looks at and says, hang on, we've already done this before. Why did you take us to war only to emerge with something that is not so very different?
OK, Paul Adams, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Well, whether you are joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or TV, thanks for your time. We will be back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.